I'd like to welcome everybody to the second webinar being done by the Central Massachusetts Jewish Theater, and in this case, in conjunction with the Center Stage Theater of Rochester, New York. A little bit of housekeeping. If you have questions, please use the Q&A button on your bar on the bottom or the top, as it may be on your particular display. We really will not be monitoring the chat for questions. If you want to chat between yourselves, go right ahead. You know, have a good time. But we won't be. We will be taking the questions from the Q&A button. Okay, to give people who are not in Rochester and who have not seen Survivors, I'm going to run a little trailer. It runs about 2 minutes.
We are very lucky people.
We will speak for the millions who were silenced.
And we are here because others risked their lives to help us.
We each have our own story, but we share what some might call a miracle.
We are all survivors. Will you stand up and fight for what's fair?
Will you offer that kind cabbage to a hungry stranger?
Will you help?
Never forget. Never again. Never. It is now.
Before we get started, before I introduce the panelists, Survivors deals with largely not only the individual stories of 10 survivors, but also the underlying theme is normalized hate, which is something with what's going on here in the United States over the past few days is very poignant and relates very well to the story of survivors. A little later in our webinar, we might get into a discussion of it in a little bit more detail. But for the moment, let me make some introductions. First, let me introduce Wendy Kout. Wendy is an award-winning writer, producer of theater, film, television, and prose. Her works include We Are the Levinsons, Naked in Encino, and Dorfman in Love, just to name a few. Wendy is a member of the Dramatists Guild and the Writers Guild of America. She also serves on the board of directors of the Skylight Theater in Los Angeles, the board of directors of the Alliance for Jewish Theater, and the honorary board of the Boston Jewish Film Festival, and the list goes on. Wendy is based in Santa Barbara, California, but in her words, she considers herself a wandering Jew. Ralph Meranto is the Associate Executive Director of the Louis S. Wolk Jewish Community Center in Rochester, New York, and the Artistic Director of the Center Stage Theater, also of the Wolk JCC. And last, but by no means least, Sheila Weinbach. Sheila is the widow of Holocaust survivor Carl Weinbach, and she should be able to bring us a very personal view with regard to survivors. And now let's get into some questions. Um, Ralph, one question I have is, what was your motivation in commissioning the play?
I've been a theater artist for many years in Rochester, and being that our theater is housed at a Jewish community center, obviously we've done a lot of work centered around the Holocaust over the years. And I've had the true honor of meeting a number of survivors over the years. And as the bit by bit, day by day, we've had less and less survivors who have been with us anymore. We are losing them a little bit each at a time. We were wondering how we were going to make sure that these stories continue to be told. So many of our survivors were very active, going into the schools, talking to the students. And as we knew that those survivors were not able to go into the schools any longer, we knew we had to figure out a way to keep their stories alive. And as a theater artist, I knew the way that I could do that would be by creating a play. So I reached out to Wendy, and I reached out to the Jewish Federation in Rochester to say, help me with the resources, and we want to put together a story that uses the actual words of actual survivors.
And how is it you chose Wendy to be the author of the play? Especially, I believe a lot of Wendy's work is in the area of comedy, and this is hardly a comedy.
No, that's very true. Well, Wendy and I had worked together on one of her projects, Naked and Encino, which is a comedy. But I got to know Wendy quite well during the process of working on that, and I got to know who she was to her soul more than just who she was in her bio. And I just knew that she would connect with this, and I was thrilled that she jumped at the chance when I called her.
Wendy, I took a look at the archive of Holocaust survivors who settled in Rochester, and it's, wow, quite bigger than I had thought. And I mean, where did you start from, and from all of these survivors, how did you pick just 10 people?
Good question. Well, first of all, I'm working with Ralph. We knew that we wanted to tell the story of the Holocaust through many different stories, not just the camps, not just the survivors of the camps, but through multiple stories. And for me, it was a natural to come up with the number 10, because 10 is a minion. And Ralph agreed with that. So, okay, now we want 10 stories, but oh my God, look at all of these stories that deserve to be told. Every Holocaust survivor's story deserves to be told. A book, a play, a film. But we had to really choose according to experience, because we wanted 10 different experiences. Fortunately, we had people throughout this process helping us. And Ralph, we had Bonnie Abrams and Barbara, and we turned to them who knew the survivors, and said, it's going to take me a year to do this research unless can you give me a list of 20 survivors that have different stories? I will research every one of those, and then I'll come back to you with the 10 stories I think will work best for this.
Our Rochester Jewish Federation has put together an archive of their stories. Some of them are written, some of them are video, some of them are audio. But they were trying to gather as much information as they could and as many testimonies from as many survivors as they could. So we were fortunate that we had their words, even if they were no longer with us. And as Wendy said, we wanted to have a cross section, people who were in the camps, people who weren't, people who got out before the war, people who hid during the war. And we wanted, because this show was designed to be something that we would be taking to schools, we wanted to make sure that we were picking people who were all young at the time of the Holocaust, so that they would connect to the audience that we were bringing it to. And I think from there, that made it pretty easy to narrow down whose stories, because so many stories are powerful. But with that criteria, it was pretty easy to figure out which stories and which people we wanted to tell, including Sheila's husband.
And including Kurt, but also from across Europe, not just Germany. This is representative of Europe through the Holocaust.
Sheila, first of all, with with your permission, I would like to play a section of the interview with Carl that is part of the Rochester archive.
I'd love that. I met Carl when he was 13, when he first came. So I knew him, and I still know him well. I know all 10 of the people, actually.
German troops marched in on March 13th, 1938. At that time, I knew a little bit more what was happening because I was always involved in knowing the politics of the world. And my brother too, who would always collect propaganda, both from the Nazis and from the communists. So our house was always a library of political propaganda. And I would say I know pretty well at that time what happened. When Hitler marched into Vienna, which means really he didn't march, he drove in an open car with about 1 million people cheering him madly. Amongst 1 million was me standing there. It was actually near our house, which was a main street. And there were again people going crazy about him. And he gave his usual salute and he drove into Vienna. That was taking over. Well, I thought it was a good circus, but it was interesting. I knew what it meant, but on the other, being a kid, I was kind of interested in all the uniforms, the soldiers, the troops. It was very exciting in a way, but I also was aware that I was the only Jew and potential victim of this whole thing. The idea of leaving came up as a reality, not because the people who were there, the Jews, were anxious to leave. Really, it was a comfortable life compared to many other places, and Vienna especially. But they pretty much had an idea what's happening. Only, of course, the answer to leaving was always, where do I go? And the chances there were very limited. But during the very first day after the Nazis occupied, what they called the Anschluss, the connection between the two, because they felt it was part of their own country. The Jews lined up from 3 in the morning at the American consulate and so to get visas and go and work. The waiting periods were tremendous. And my mother was actually one of those who lined up to get a visa, which then took a few years. And we got, but we had no chance to use it.
Sheila, you want to tell us a little bit about the Kurt's actual his story, how he did get out of Germany or Austria, actually?
Compose myself. It's the first time I've actually looked at that since he passed away. So his story is extremely unique. Everybody's story is unique in some special way, but my husband was saved by a Nazi general. He was not a Nazi, he was a German general, originally in the Austrian army. My father-in-law had been his officer, his sergeant. He was the office clerk, and they were very good friends. They got along very, very well. But my father-in-law was a very early photographer, and he was able to take pictures of all of the soldiers, travel from Czechoslovakia to Vienna, Austria, and get packages from the family and bring them photos. So he was the darling of the unit, and it's so frequent with military and with men in general. They gave him a nickname. They call him Christ Killer. So even though they liked him, they respected him. So one day after the Austria had been taken over, Kurt was 10 years old at the time, he sent a note to the general and congratulated him because the general had become the head of all of the military for the whole country of Austria. He sent him a note, and he was invited back to come. And when he came, in Kurt's words, he would say, "It's not like today where the soldiers are wearing fatigues." They had all of their medals on their chests, and they had all of the ribbons. They did not want to let him in, but eventually he proved that he was there. Eichmann was one of these people waiting. They called him in immediately, And he said to him, Izzy, that was his name, Isidore, or Israel. And he said, Izzy, I ought to have you shot. All these years, you knew who I was because my name was in the paper, and now you get in touch with me. But seriously, if you want, you can stay as long as I can protect you. But there'll come a time when I can't protect you anymore, and then you'll have to leave. And that day came in 1941. And as far as Kurt knew, his family were the last ones to get out legally. And where would they go? Well, they would join their son, their other older son, who had escaped in 1938. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Maybe we'll get into it, or maybe we won't. But at age 17, he had to escape. He went to China. And so my husband, who was lucky enough to have his parents, joined his brother in Tianjin, China, which is the port city for Beijing. That wasn't the end of his travels. He also fought in the Israeli army.
Thank you, Sheila. Ralph, I know the play has been performed on stage at the theater at the JCC, but it's also gone on the road, so to speak, to a lot of schools in the area. Could you speak to that and to the number of students that you've actually performed in front of?
Yeah. So one of the things I said to Wendy early on was, I want this play because I want to take it to the schools, because I feel like this is a story we need to tell the next generation. But I don't want it to be something that feels like it's talking down to school children, or that it feels like it's a play for middle schoolers. So we have performed this play for middle schoolers, high schoolers, college, and adults. And everyone feels a connectivity to the story when they're in the audience there. So no one feels like they're watching a young audience version of the Holocaust. We didn't pull any punches. We are as honest and complete in the storytelling as we could be. And as a result, it's really connected with people across the spectrum. So in our first year, it was a smaller group, a few thousand kids saw it because we wanted to make sure that we got the storytelling right. One of the questions that somebody popped up already was, could this be customized for different communities? And although in theory it could, the amount of work that's gone into it over the last 3 years, from a rough script, changing the script, to continue to hone the dialogue and bring it to a point where in one concise hour, we can tell the story of these 10 survivors from a variety of different backgrounds. It's taken 3 years of writes and rewrites and rehearsals and different actors and different productions with different audiences, getting feedback, changing it. Just like any new play, it evolves, even though all of the words are the words of these actual survivors plus historical context. So last year was our largest year, where we toured it to over 7,000 people in the Rochester area. They either came to our theater at the JCC in small groups, or we brought the play to them for bigger groups. And this year we were poised to hit about 10,000 area people in both Rochester and some surrounding areas, including Buffalo. And literally the evening before the first performance was supposed to happen, the pandemic reached the area. Schools shut down, large gatherings were banned. And so we, this year, have brought the production to zero, except for a little bit of online work that we did for one school. The audiences have not been able to see the play this year, which is a great, great tragedy.
Wendy, one of the things I noticed in reading the script, which I have done numerous times, unfortunately, I haven't had the pleasure of seeing the production in Rochester, is you seem to involve the audience much more than many plays where the audience are just sitting there and they're viewers. You have characters speaking directly to the audience. Could you elaborate on that a little bit and why you chose that technique?
Several reasons. Initially, when we envisioned the play, it was for middle school kids and older. So I had a conversation with the middle school child in me. And I asked her, what's going to engage you on that stage? And I know from my experience of being that age and learning about history, what engages me is when someone's speaking directly to me and when they're telling me their personal story, not facts and figures that you have to memorize, but they're telling me their story from their heart. Anne Frank, why is that book the most beloved book? It's her story from her heart. So, but the idea of engaging the audience was certainly part of that. And it's also, I think it's a technique of storytelling that's compelling, where you're speaking directly to the audience, you're looking at the audience, you're engaging the audience, and then you're turning into a scene and enacting a scene. So the audience is constantly on their toes, engaged with you. It's not just someone talking at you. They're not telling you the story. They're bringing you in as a guide into an enacted story. So that's pretty much, Ralph, anything to add on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, and so much of the testimonies came from people directly telling their stories. So in order to really use their words and I mean, I think you saw how powerful it was. Sheila watched her husband speaking his words. It was that kind of testimony, either written or audio or video, that we use as the source material to create the play. And it has made a huge difference. The audiences are connecting with it. And they see the story now as human, with actual people, instead of facts and figures in a book, as Wendy said. Now, of course, we've had to fill in the blanks with the historical context so that people understand it. But the goal was to take out a lot of dates, to take out accents. The majority of the play is performed without any sort of a German accent, because these are universal characters who went through a universal experience that we don't want to put this distance between and say this happened in the past and it's not related to what's happening in the world today.
And Wendy, how did writing the play affect you?
Affected me deeply. I mean, first of all, to be given this honor and this responsibility was very powerful for me. That first of all, Ralph was entrusting me with the telling of survivor stories. First of all, that humbles you. And I will tell you that the way I approached that awesome responsibility was through prayer and through speaking to the survivors themselves. I don't know if you feel Kurt with you, but since the moment I received this commission, I have felt all 10 of the survivors with me, so that I'm just the instrument. Tell me your story. Tell me what you want to say. So that kind of communion is very special. And it also, in a personal sense, when you work through your head and your heart in this kind of story, you're dancing in between all the time. But when you're living so intimately with the horrors that these extraordinary people lived, it absolutely humbles you in terms of your perception of the world and your own life. And it absolutely lifts you into your own strength to survive. So that's one of the reasons why it's just such a relevant story for our times, not just as we want to preserve legacy, of course, and history, of course. These stories must be remembered, but it so relates to our time. And I know we're going to talk about that, but it relates personally to your own struggles. How are you a survivor? How do you survive? Well, when you've gotten to know 10 people like this, you don't complain about the weather anymore.
Okay, I think we have a couple of questions, and I have my wife Judy has been monitoring the questions, and if she pushes her space bar and unmutes, she can go ahead and see what we've got in questions.
This is a question specifically for you, Wendy, from Tony. He's asking, in light of the events of the last few days, I was struck by the quote in the trailer, "Will you be silent or will you speak out against hatred?" Do Jewish Americans have a particular responsibility to speak out in support of racial justice and equality?
My sense is that's from Tony Silbert, who we call Rabbi Tony. He's a dear friend of the family and a beloved friend. Yes, Tony, yes. And I would say it is not only the responsibility of Jewish Americans, it's responsibility of all Americans. When you see hatred, when you see someone, I can't even speak of it, but when you see an act like that, it could be anything from just a child being bullied to an act like that that takes a life. You have to scream, you have to speak out. And that's part of why the survivor stories, I think, is so relevant, because it's a warning about normalizing hatred, and it's a guide to tell you, speak out. Don't let this, never again, never is now. And it is now. So yes, please, everyone who feels this, get involved, speak out. I think we're robbing the discussion for later, Hal, but let it on top.
That's fine. You know, we worked right into it, so fine. Let's stay with it. Another question.
Yes, Patty has a two-part question. After you perform the plays in the schools, do you have discussions with the students, and also are the families of the students invited to attend the performances?
Yeah, there is a talk back after every performance. We have asked the schools to always do that, and every single one of them has felt that was important. And it has been very powerful and impactful to do that. There have been a couple of school districts where they've done afternoon performances with the students and then evening performances for the community to come. At the JCC, at our theater in Rochester, New York, we have done several performances where the community can come, where people can come as a family. But in general, no, it's handled by the teachers and the study guide that we have put together to help guide the teachers through this process. Sheila, you've been at a lot of the performances as part of the talkback. We try to have a survivor or a family member of a survivor there whenever possible. So maybe Sheila, maybe you can talk a little bit about the reactions from the students.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see. I think some of them are really stunned. I mean, and when we ask them to participate, it takes a while. They're not quite ready to do that. And the name of the play is The Survivors, and teenage suicide is constantly growing. So my personal thing that I try to do is let them know that in spite of everything, they will survive. They can survive. Unfortunately, there's not always time at the JCC, and those are the ones that I've done, to have as many as raise their hand. Finally, after the initial stunning, they're ready to talk, but then the time runs out.
But we've had students who were people of color. We've had students who were part of the LGBTQ community come up to us after performances and say, you know, I see my story there. Even though the story isn't specifically about them, this is a universal story that everyone should be able to understand and understand how the impact is on them and the people around them. And with what is happening in the world right now, as I believe Patty was saying, we have to speak up. It is our obligation as artists, as citizens, as Americans, to speak up for anyone who is oppressed. And we think about how some of the survivors in this play only survived because others stood by them and protected them. They were willing to take them in. They were willing to say, no, you will not take my patient from a doctor when he was in the hospital. No, you will not destroy this store because this is a member of our community. People stood up and were advocates. And when they did that, then these 10 people were able to survive. So it is our obligation to do that for the African-American community now, for the LGBT community, for all people of color, for anyone who's oppressed anywhere. It is everyone's obligation to not isolate them and say, well, that is only happening to them, so it doesn't affect me. It does affect you.
My husband was very proud to tell people you can make a difference. So many people say, I'm only one person. He said, it only takes one.
Yes. And also, it's not just about speaking up, it's about the personalization of speaking your story. If you are being oppressed, if you are being bullied, if you are having to deal with hatred or brutality in your life, the play encourages you to speak up, tell your story. That's what our survivors have done for us, and they are our guides. So we're trying to empower young people to speak up and tell their story as well.
There's a line in the play where one of the survivors says, the kindness of a simple cabbage. That makes me cry every time I see a rehearsal or a performance of the play, because without that kindness, you can't survive.
Wendy, there's a question for you from Perry and Susie. They would like to know that if you were to write this play, if you would write this play differently now, knowing what has been happening in our own country over the recent months, weeks, and days.
Thank you, Perry and Simon, dear friends. I love you and I miss you. I wish I could see your faces. I actually have done a adaptation of Survivors for another theater called Never Is Now, which is the telling of the survivor's story through the modern prism of the times we're living in right now. Now that was a production that ran in the fall. That's before this moment. But as far as I'm concerned, when I write a play, it's never done. If Ralph were to say to me tomorrow, let's think about what Perry and Susie said. Let's think if there's ways we should go back in. And I'm fully expecting that phone call tomorrow, Ralph. So, but that's why the play took 3 years and will take forever, because it's never going to be done. None of my plays are. So thank you for that. My head already went there, which is, okay, how do we keep this play as relevant and as connective as possible? Ralph, I'll talk to you tomorrow.
Yep.
Do we have anything else?
Surely I have more friends out there.
Yeah.
I'd like to say something about the current situation and the survivors. They went through hell. They had every reason in the world to hate, to want revenge, and almost nobody looked for revenge. Their goal was to live as much as they could, to make a new life, and to find a home, to get a job, to start a family, to raise children. And so many of them have said to me individually, and I've seen it in writing also, the revenge that they got was to have children, grandchildren, and friends. So I think it's important for people to know that you can survive racism, you can survive hate without being destructive. I don't know, Hal, if you want me to talk about this now, but I lived on a very Jewish street. That's how I knew all the 10 survivors. When people came to Rochester, they lived in the Jewish neighborhood because there were Jewish butchers, Jewish bakers, and all kinds of other things there. There were 21 synagogues within a 10-block radius. And this is very hard to say because in 1964, Rochester saw terrible, terrible race riots. The whole street was destroyed. Every store was vandalized. Every store was broken into. There were no peaceful demonstrations like there are now. There are wonderful people who are doing wonderful things. But when people destroy their own neighborhoods, rather than going forward, I think we have to acknowledge that. Yet the people who do the peaceful demonstrations, they want to educate us. They want us to let us know what can happen. But the people who destroy, they're destroying their own world. There no longer is a Jewish street in Rochester. It doesn't exist anymore.
Okay, I have a question here from Linda. She wants to know how much, if any, information of history of the Holocaust is given prior to seeing the play.
Yeah, our team has put together a really impactful study guide for the teachers, and we make sure that the teachers are up to speed on all of it. Now, whether or not they, how far they go with the materials they have to their students varies from school to school. But we hopefully, and we continue to update the study guide as well, but we try to put together as much material as possible that they can properly prepare their students for it, and then follow up with it for impact afterward.
But I'd also like to add that after the first performance, lots was added so that there are historical things that are there that tells what was happening at the time period when each of the stories are told. And so you could come to that play never having heard of the Holocaust and walk away knowing a lot, not only the stories of the 10 people that are told and the people that helped them and the people that hurt them, but you could also know what was happening in that time period. I think it's a wonderful education experience. And I hope that, Hal, if and when the time comes, you can put it together. You can use some of those historic cuttings because they are good.
Yeah, we make sure that we use visual imagery during the show as well. Music helps tell the story, photographs, and both at the beginning of the play and the end of the play, the actual photographs of the 10 survivors are projected or on a card if you don't have projection capabilities in a particular theater, so that the audiences can see that these are real people. And it is very powerful to see them at the beginning when they're young, and then at the end, the contrast between their young photographs and the photographs of when they are older. And you see this life that has been lived that wouldn't have been lived if it weren't for them being able to be survivors from the actions that happened to them during the course of the war and through their lives.
So just to be clear, the play tells the story of the Holocaust in chronology. It is a teaching of the Holocaust through the personal prism of testimony.
Right, right. We start with them young and happy and enjoying their lives before anything is going wrong. They have friends, they're being treated with respect. And then we watch how bit by bit rights were taken away, they were ostracized, and we see each thing that happens along the way. And so there's a little bit of humor and fun at the beginning as we see their lives. They fall in love. They have friends, things like that that were happening to everyone. And I think that helps the students understand that, you know, whatever they're going through, whatever troubles they have, there is a way to get through that. And I think it's unfortunately ironic that during a pandemic when so many people were not able to go out and do things and were sequestered to their homes, and then this experience of these people in hiding, these experience of these survivors who were deprived of so many things in their lives, who went from here to there in a manner of having to hide or having to go through this, and the little things that we are trying to deal with, the inconvenience that we have to put a mask on in order to go to the grocery store. I think it puts that in perspective for people when they think about what these survivors had to go through.
I think another interesting fact is what most of us, when you say Holocaust survivor, immediately think of concentration camp survivors. And each of these 10 stories is different. There are concentration camp survivors. There's Kurt's story and his family escaping by way of China. There's the Kinder transport, and many others that are covered in the play. And I just think it opens people's eyes to that it wasn't just concentration camps.
Henry, who was one of the Birkenau boys, that's a very important story to be told. Yeah, each of the 10 have something unique about them, and that's what I think is the beauty of Wendy's writing, is that she was able to take literally hours and hours and hours of testimony and weave it together to tell this amazingly impactful story.
Hal, you brought up an interesting point. My husband didn't consider himself a survivor because he was not in a camp. So it was only in the 80s and 90s that the definition of survivor turned to anybody whose life was affected by the Nazis or whose life was changed, so that even people who escaped in 1938 or in the 30s were considered survivors because their lives were entirely changed. So it took a while. And some people still, including my late brother-in-law's children, they don't want to recognize that their father was a survivor because he wasn't in the camps. So that's Wendy bringing out all of these stories, I think is a wonderful, again, there's so much to learn from this play.
We have a question from Francis in Victoria, British Columbia. Apparently they were in the process of planning to mount this play in the schools when COVID intervened. Can this play be adapted for online or virtual presentation? What do you advise, and are you considering this prospect?
Well, the short answer is yes. Anything can be done. We'll be happy to work with you up there in your area to see if we can put this together. We explored possibly doing that this year, and the schools felt like it was a little too rushed in this process of going to this immediate online world where they had so much material to cover that most of them decided we were going to delay the shows until next year. But if school in-school tours are not allowed, finding a way to either record it or to do it in a Zoom format is certainly possible. We did one rehearsal with the current cast via Zoom. We felt it could be done that way, but it's certainly more powerful when we can do it live, and hopefully the world will allow us to be able to have live performances again.
Another question from Patty. She says, I certainly acknowledge that there are injustices committed against African Americans, the LGBTQ community, immigrants, etc. What about the recent uptick in anti-Semitism?
Sure. Of course. That's what we're addressing here. Primarily, that's what we were addressing. But when you start to understand that the motto of never again, never is now is, and also that our wonderful survivors are warning us, I believe, not just for the Jewish people, but for all people, for other genocides. The great Harold Schulweis, Rabbi Harold Schulweis, made that first connection to Darfur and, brought that consciousness to, I think, the Jewish world. But I don't think it's a question of either or, of this being, it's about the Jewish story or it's not. Of course it's about the Jewish story. We're speaking about the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, but that is relatable to all forms of hatred and oppression. So let that connect us, not divide us.
I want to make a comment. I'm wearing what is a flag pin. It's half Israel, half the United States. As the widow of a survivor, somebody who knew almost every survivor who ever came to Rochester, somebody who lost a lot of family, myself, I am very, very aware of anti-Semitism and that it exists. As Jews, we're taught in every generation, there'll be somebody who will uprise. So I wear this pin most of the time so that people know the importance of Israel. Maybe 6 million wouldn't have died and so many people wouldn't have suffered if there would have been a place to run to. So yes, anti-Semitism is rising. Some people blame the new virus on the Jews. It's been publicized all over.
When I started writing the play, I thought I was writing a history play. And several months later, there were tiki torches carried by neo-Nazis in Charlottesville. And that's when I really understood what we were going to be doing with this play.
We had a partial question from Steve Schimmel, who said, I have a question. Steve, if you would type out the rest of your question, we'd be happy to deal with it.
I would like to say is I really appreciate Hal reaching out to us to produce the play. Our goal is to eventually have this be a play that can be licensed across the country. And we, as I said, there's a couple of people on this chat right now who are also planning to produce the play. Wendy adapted it for a theater in Los Angeles. And this has all been without any real effort to try and sell the play to other theaters. We really wanted to make sure we got the storytelling right and the preparation material right before we started reaching out and saying this is a play available for licensing. And so I feel like this is a very universal story. These 10 survivors may all have ended up in Rochester. And that's why we picked them, because we're a Rochester-based theater at our Jewish Community Center. But it really is a story that works anywhere for any audience, because these stories are really universal. And so as we work through the recent changes that we've made to the script that are in the current version, we will be working on a version that we'll be able to license to theaters across the country. And we thank Hal and St. Louis and Zelda, who are part of the next wave of theaters that are going to produce it. And your feedback is going to help us continue to improve it as well, so that we have a piece that really, so that Sheila's husband's story can be told from coast to coast. And that's
and his message that you too can make a difference. That was his primary message. You can make a difference.
The story is so strong. I'll take a moment to tell you how I came about this. It's through a friend of mine of Judy and in Rochester, who mentioned the play to me and said, why don't you call Ralph and find out about it? And I did call Ralph, and they sent me a copy of the script. And once I read the script, I was hooked. That was it. I knew this play had to be done here in Worcester. At the time, I was working with another theater group, and not particularly a Jewish-oriented theater group, although they did have done some Jewish productions. And the director of that group was a little kind of wishy-washy about doing it. Maybe yes, maybe no. And I said, So I just had to take the bull by the horns. And that's how I started the Central Massachusetts Jewish Theater Company, was to do this particular play. In the meantime, there are more plays that have come about. And we are very, very excited about doing the play here in Worcester next spring in conjunction with Yom HaShoah. And hopefully things will be back to some semblance of normal, and we will be able to do it at that time. But it's a wonderful, moving, important play. Okay, and now we do have the question from Steve.
Steve and Alyssa are writing that I grew up in Vinland, New Jersey, a large community of survivors. One of our rabbis is a survivor. He was very vocal during Yom HaShoah, stressing that the Holocaust was a unique experience, nothing like it. It created an interesting situation for the educators who tried to teach more universal lessons. It's so nuanced and yet such an opportunity if done right. Thank you, Steve.
And thank you, Steve, for you and the Federation being very supportive of my endeavor.
I think it's important for people to know that the audience does not have to be Jewish. As a matter of fact, it's been shown to a number of Catholic schools, and I've brought friends who know nothing about the Holocaust, who are not Jewish, and they came away extremely moved. So I think it's important, maybe more important, that people who are not Jewish or who have no Jewish background see the play. So I'm hoping, Hal, that when you do it, it will be open to the general audiences, and that once you stage it, you could take it around like Ralph has done, because they've done an amazing job. How many schools? I knew you mentioned 7,000 people.
25 last year. Yeah. 25 different schools last year. You know, I think what Stephen is bringing up, which I think is very important, is yes, it is true that there is nothing else like the Holocaust that happened that we're telling the story, and we are not trying to any way blend it in with other tragedies that have happened in the world. But I think there are lessons to be learned from it that apply to other things that are happening in the world, and it is a unique situation. To try to be able to tell this story, but to make everyone not look at it as a historical situation. I don't know, Wendy, maybe you want to comment a little further on that. You know, we're certainly not trying to turn the Holocaust into a universal story, but we do find that there are universal themes.
Yes, and also that when you look at history and you look at that particular moment in history, and the Jews were targeted, and as were a number of other groups that Hitler targeted, and there were millions of others lost through that time that weren't Jewish, but were gay or were priests or were Black, or the Romani people who were targeted. So there's just this sense of I feel that I'm telling the Holocaust story, but it's also a tremendous responsibility, because so many perished through that time, and so many continue to perish through hatred. So I think we resonate where we resonate, and for us, if the young people who are seeing this play, if it opens their eyes, hearts, and minds, if they become kinder people, if they see one of their classmates or they're being bullied and that changes them, if it turns them into better citizens, we've done our job. And if we've done our job, it's only because the survivors spoke and told their stories. We're honoring them. They live on and continue, although they were victims. For me, by doing this. They live on and they change the world.
Thank you, Wendy. If there are no more questions, I think we will wrap it up. I really want to, again, well, we do have another question.
Lynn is asking, will you consider using tonight's presentation to introduce, market the play to potential audiences?
Great idea, Lynn. Thanks for the motivation.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you. I wish we could see you.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Sheila. And thank you all the attendees that made this webinar worthwhile. And I hope to be bringing you more webinars as the time goes on, especially as long as the theaters are dark. We have to do something. I'm hoping for the next time around a little change in pace and do something in the comedic area. So looking at some we're looking at some things by Ralph Orloff from Rich Orloff. I'm sorry. Hey,
It's okay. It's okay.
From his play, Oi.
Yes, he's wonderful.
And okay, so again, thank you very much to everybody, and hope to be talking with you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.